Welcome to the second episode of the FEH Report. Today's discussion will be about the meta. The meta is such a large topic, we're going to have to break it apart into a few pieces. So over the next 3 weeks, we'll be discussing 3 different parts. Today, we'll be discussing what is the meta and what kind of metas exist in Fire Emblem Heroes. Next week, we'll be talking about the history of the meta and how the meta shifts. And in the last part, we'll be discussing the current meta, the most effective strategies, and the units for those strategies. Now, this discussion will be mostly concerning the Ether Raids meta. If you're interested in an arena meta episode, let me know. Let's start with what is meta. So meta is broken down into most effective tactics available. So essentially, this is going to be the pinnacle of gameplay. These are the most effective ways to win and the units that are going to be most likely used in those strategies. Fire Emblem Heroes, there's essentially 2 types of meta, the strategy meta and the unit meta. The unit meta is much more common and is mostly what you're going to be hearing about. But let's start with discussing the strategy meta so we can have a better understanding of how the units interact with the strategy meta. So if we look at Fire Emblem Heroes, there's essentially 3 core strategies that dominate the meta: hit and run, tanking, and Gale Force. There are other options that exist as well, but most strategies fall under one of these umbrellas. So for the idea of hit and run is essentially a strategy where you send in the unit, take out 1 or 2 units back up outside of the threat range of the enemy team, and then wait to re-engage. In doing so, you kind of take out little parts of the team until eventually the team is defeated and you are able to win. Examples of this team would be like Yuri hit and run, Duo Lin hit and run, or even like a Kanto or Trace unit hit and run. Some other strategies that you've heard of that are hit and run strategies are like the PvE strategy, where you essentially have 1 powerful unit and a whole bunch of dancers that support them, and then you go in, take out key units, back up with your dancers, and then do it again, and then the team is usually taken out. Next, we have the tanking strategy. So the idea of tanking strategy is very simple. You use a powerful unit to take on the enemy team, so they'll engage you, fight, and then the tank needs to be able to not only defeat those units, but survive the onslaught of the enemy team. So examples of this, there's a million. It's one of the most common strategies. So you have like Omni tanking, where you have 1 powerful unit with lots of supports around them. You have the save ball, where you have 2 units with different types of save, near save and far save, and then they kind of make a ball and then just take on the enemy team 1 by 1. You have the half save tank teams, where you use 1/2 of a save unit. Like for example, you could use like far save Hector or far save Ascendant Fiorm, and then you just have another unit out there who kind of fights some of the melee threats, and then the other one just takes on the range threats for you. There's backline tanking, where you send in a very powerful 1-man unit. They go in and snipe one of the key offensive parts of your enemy team and then tank the rest. There's a million concepts of tanking and lots of different strategies that exist under this umbrella. Next, you have Gale Force, and it takes its name from the special Gale Force, obviously, which allows you to have another action on that unit. The concept of the team is very simple. You essentially wipe out the enemy team or disable them in 1 to 2 turns. So typically you will send in a unit, that unit will engage, get down below 50% HP, so that other units with the Wings of Mercy ability can teleport in and then take out the other units on the team. Usually you lock 1 unit away, or you remove all the threatening units, so then you can acquire the pots and then win the match. There are tons of different types of Gale Force strategies. They're all called Gale Force. Like you have Beast Force, you have Air Force, where you use air as an engagement unit. You have Range Gale Force, which is also similar to Air Force, where like maybe you use like Duolith, who goes in at range, gets to that 1 HP from his Miracle, and then you have some other units follow up. And then you have your typical Gale Force, usually where you have like a melee unit come in, get in the Wings of Mercy range, and then starts a Gale Force train. There are other options for strategies, but those are the 3 key ones. Another one I can think of is Vantage Sweeping, which is kind of an interesting strategy. It's a mix of sniping and tanking in quotes. Like essentially you'll send in a unit with Vantage, they'll kill one of the key members of the enemy team, so they're sniping that unit essentially, and then they will tank, right, by essentially having everybody attack them, and then they will kill them with Vantage before they get a chance to be hit. So now that we have a basic idea of some of the meta strategies that are available in Fire Emblem Heroes, let's talk about the reasons why these strategies are meta to begin with. So essentially it comes down to 3 aspects. 1, availability, 2, effectiveness or power, and 3, difficulty of execution. While effectiveness does seem like it would be the number 1 variable for how meta a strategy can be, it's actually availability that matters the most. If the key parts or units of a strategy are not available, then it will have a difficult time taking up part of the meta. Even if it's the most effective strategy available right now, if very few players can actually effectively use that strategy because they don't have the parts of it, then it will take up a very small part of the meta and it won't be seen as often. Typically in Fire Emblem Heroes, this is tied to the availability of certain key units, which we'll be talking about a bit more later, but sometimes it will rely on buildings as well. Examples of this could be possibly needing a highly leveled catapult or another highly leveled building to execute the strategy, which can be common in Ether Raid's defense if you need a certain building to be at a certain level, especially the catapult, because it's essentially ineffective if it's not high enough level to snipe the key buildings you need it to snipe. The next major variable in strategies being meta is effectiveness. So essentially this is the ability for the strategy to effectively win a match. The effectiveness of a strategy essentially comes down to matchups, right? So when you enter into an Ether Raids match, you look at the map and then you must decide what kind of matchup you think is most likely to win against that defense team. So strategies that have very high effectiveness against multiple different types of maps will do well and typically become the meta strategies that we will see in Ether Raids. Of course, effectiveness of strategies wane and change as the meta changes itself. Some examples of this was that the God Sword meta, the speedy sword tanks we saw so much of not more than a year ago, were extremely meta, but over time, because of the introduction of new units and new buildings as well, that meta began to change and that strategy became less and less effective. The third variable is the difficulty of execution. If a strategy is extremely difficult to pull off, then it becomes less desirable for the majority of the player base, as it will require a certain level of skill to be able to be used. So it will always be a part of the meta, but maybe a smaller percent of the meta, instead of the more common, more easily usable strategies. An example of this for the longest time would be Gale Force. Gale Force has always been a powerful strategy since the beginning of Ether Raids, but it was difficult to pull off, and over time we've been introduced to more units and more tools to allow Gale Force to become a more desirable and easily executed strategy. On the other hand, we have tanking. Tanking is typically a very simple and easy strategy that just requires proper preparation and planning. And historically, tanking has been the most popular strategy. We can see from the very beginning of Ether Raids that tanking was one of the key strategies used, and even though tanking has changed over the years, it's still easily the most popular strategy used in Ether Raids. Another example of this could be the hit and run strategy's popularity rising because of the safety fence's introduction. Before, hit and run could be very easy or it could be very difficult depending on the enemy's team, but with the introduction of the safety fence, it's made it so much easier to snipe units and then hit and run the rest of their team. This is also due to the introduction of many powerful units and new skills such as Canto or the Trace skills. So now that we have a basic idea of the common strategies used and what makes them meta strategies, let's look at the units who make those strategies possible. When you think of the Fire Emblem Heroes meta, you typically think of the meta units. It's the meta that is much more commonly talked about, it's what you see in videos typically, and is much more discussed. Typically the unit meta is the highest percentage of used characters or the most powerful characters that are available at the time. You'll often see this information formatted in a tier list, though tier lists don't offer the nuance really necessary to understand how the meta works. So let's once again talk about the variables that determine a meta unit. And this comes down to 4 key variables. 1. Availability. 2. Power and effectiveness. 3. Difficulty of use. And 4. Popularity. Once again, availability is the most important variable to determine if a unit can be meta or not. Let's create a small example to show you what I mean. Let's say there's a unit that is introduced that can destroy any unit with one hit and cannot be killed. Obviously this unit would be the most dominant thing in the meta, but let's say this unit was only available on a banner for 10 minutes at 100th of a percentage. Realistically, no one would be able to get their hands on this unit. There would be the very few ultra lucky people who could, but most people wouldn't. So even though this unit would be the most dominant thing possible in the meta and could win every single match if they were available, if no one is able to get their hands on them, then they can't effectively put them into any strategy or build strategies around them. This is why things like free units, grail units, sparkable units is such a big deal, because it allows access to the character and it allows players to create strategies that are centered around that unit or strategies to counter that unit. In Fire Emblem Heroes, there's lots of different types of availability. So on the top with the most available units are free units. These are the units that everyone gets just by playing the game, such as Legendary Ike, Fjorm, Air, Regan, or Peony, right? Anyone can play with them. Just by playing through the story, you get access to them, and it means that anyone can build a strategy around those characters. Next, we have the Grail units. The Grail units are available to anyone. Anyone can pick them up. Anyone can easily merge them up, though it might take more time for one player than another. Just the ability to play with that character and create strategies around them makes them the second most available unit. Next, we have the 3 to 4 star units that are easily summoned, though there is quite a bit of variance now because the pool has gone so large. Sometimes you'll see a unit immediately and you'll get a few copies, and then sometimes it can be months and you don't get a few copies. So these units aren't guaranteed by any means, like a Grail unit or a free unit, but they are much more common than any of the other units that are about to come. After them, we have the older units. So these are like the Gen 1, Gen 2, maybe even Gen 3 units. These units have been on a million banners, and you've probably picked up most of them just through free summons or summoning them in the past. Typically, these units aren't the most meta-defining, but that's not always the case. Some of them have gotten really great refines or remixes and are now demanding some attention. After that, we have sparkable units. Sparking is absolutely massive and has allowed so many more strategies to flourish and the meta to shift much more than it has ever before, because now new powerful units are available to everyone with a minimum amount of summoning. After that, we have the normal 5 stars. These are the units that are in the permanent pool, so you have a chance to summon them on their premier banner, and then they usually have 2 to 3 reruns throughout the year, and then there's also the chance you just randomly pick one up as a pity breaker. After that, we have the legendary and mythics. These units do come back more often than a typical unit, but they do share with 2 other units, so it can be quite difficult to get them. You could easily spend 500 orbs on a legendary mythic banner and not get the unit. This is why the reason sparking on legendary mythic banners is such a large deal, because it increases the availability of these units to the people who have FEH. This allows FEH users to create strategies around these characters, which allows them to use these characters in strategies and allows them to build strategies centered on these characters. That's not even talking about how much easier it is to merge them up. After that, we have seasonal 4 stars. Seasonal 4 stars are easier to get while the banner is running or on their rerun possibly, but after that, they're pretty much unobtainable the rest of the year. And then lastly, we have seasonal 5 stars. So seasonal 5 stars are easily the most difficult units to get in the game, though with the sparking of the FEH, it has become much more easy. Often seasonal 5 stars also contain very powerful skills or very powerful effects. Many duo units are locked to seasonal 5 stars. And so while these units may offer a major impact to the meta, often it takes much more time for them to become available to see the real impact that they can cause. The other aspect of availability is actually how available the unit is to use. So this comes down to typically legendary and mythic units, as legendary units can only truly be used in the seasons that they are, right? So you can only use an Earth legendary in Earth season and score well. The same with Light or Astral units. So that availability can greatly hinder a unit's impact on the meta. For example, we have a unit like Legendary Claude. Legendary Claude is an extremely powerful unit, and he does show up in Ether Raids a lot, but typically it's in Earth season. That's because in Earth season he gets all the mythic buffs, and he also doesn't negatively affect your defense score. Outside of Earth season, he's less common, and this is all just to the fact that he's a legendary hero. If Legendary Claude had been a blessable unit, his impact on the meta would have been much greater. We can see how this availability works in Ether Raids very simply. The best example of this is how we can see that there are technically 2 different metas in Ether Raids. There's the Astral meta and the Light meta. They are very similar, but the fact that mythic units are required essentially in Ether Raids can vastly alter what strategies are used. The availability of mythics kind of works in the same way, because they are tied to their season. You can only see their impact on the meta in that season. And so you'll often see defense teams that are built to counter certain meta mythic units because their usage is so high in that season. When it comes down to it, no matter how powerful a unit is, if you don't have that unit, you can't use them. And so when you look at the entire player base, you have to take into consideration how many people actually have this unit. Next, let's talk about the power of units and how effective they are. Unfortunately, not all units are created equal, especially in Fire Emblem Heroes. You have units who are 3 to 4 demotes, 3 to 4 stars with PRF weapons, 5-star units that have inheritable weapons, 5-star units who have PRF weapons. You have duo units, you have legendary units, you have mythic units. And each of these units have different levels of power. So when it comes to the power of a unit, there's actually several comparisons you have to make. You can look at a unit objectively and just say that they are a powerful unit, but realistically you need to compare them to their peers. And this comes in 2 ways as well. So you compare them to units of the same type, so like let's say you compare a Lance Cav to another Lance Cav, but you also compare them to roles and strategies. So for example, you may compare Brave Erica to Legendary Ephraim. You can see the differences in their kits, where their strengths and weaknesses lie, and then judge which one is stronger. But you may also compare Brave Erica as a Gale Force engagement unit compared to Pirate Tibbert. So you can look at Brave Erica, see that she is overall more powerful, she can deal more damage and take out more units. But then you can look at Pirate Tibbert, see that he's a flying unit and has beast synergy. So when it comes to power, it's not so simple as just saying this is a good unit, but you need to figure out how good they are compared to their peers, as well as how good they are in certain strategies. The other major aspect of power or effectiveness is if there's a strategy that can be used for that character. So if a powerful character comes out, but there's no role for them to play in any of the meta strategies, then even though they're powerful, they might not end up being a meta unit. Though that's not to say that they'll never be a meta unit, it's possible as the meta shifts that they might become more prominent. Lastly, the other major aspect of understanding how a unit can be powerful or a meta unit is understanding their matchups against other powerful or meta units. An example of this could be Fallen Edelgard. Fallen Edelgard showed up, extremely powerful unit with all types of strategies. So what do we see? We see the Aether Aid's defense meta shift a bit. We start to see units who can use Windsweep effectively, units who can use NFU effectively, and that makes it so that those units who have those aspects become more prominent in the meta. This is why often we hear of all these powerful units coming out, we look at a new banner and say this unit is good, but then often you don't see them for months at a time, or even at all, and it's because they don't have an effective place in a strategy or have bad matchups against units who are already powerful or in the meta. The next aspect is difficulty of use. Once again, units are not built the same. Some units are very simple to use while others can be much more difficult. A unit like Brave Hector is much easier to use than a unit like Duo Leaf. Brave Hector, you just kind of put in there, you plomp him, you put a save skill on him, and he does his job with the proper support. While Duo Leaf, you really need to understand how to properly hit and run, or how to properly set up ranged Gale Force plays. You also need to be able to do the math to ensure that he gets into those HP thresholds. Another aspect can be the general use of a unit. If a unit is extremely niche, or they have a general usefulness, a unit that can be used in lots of different situations is often going to have an easier time becoming a meta unit compared to a unit who has a very small niche situation. The only way that a niche unit can really become prominent in the meta is if a problematic unit shows up that they counter. An example of this could be the Flash Plus staff. As saved units became more and more meta over the year, that weapon became more and more prominent in the meta because it directly countered those saved units. Now we have Ascendant Fjorm, so it's not quite the same, but the idea still stands. The last major aspect of a unit becoming meta or not is popularity. Now this seems a bit weird, but the public opinion definitely matters in certain situations. If a unit is released and the general consensus is that unit is weak, then often people won't even pick up the unit and try them out. They'll just throw them in the barracks or not even summon for them, and then that unit never even gets a chance to be viable in the meta. An example of this could be like Brave Mary Ann, where most people saw her kit and thought she wasn't very powerful, and so they didn't even give her a chance to see how good she could actually be. Another aspect of popularity could be character popularity. So when a unit comes out and that character is extremely popular, then many people will summon him just for that reason, and then that unit will be used and they'll get an idea of how powerful they can actually be and how they can have a spot in the meta. Examples of this could be whenever a Three Houses character comes out, everybody who loves that character summons for them, and then inevitably people will attempt to use that unit in some way. They might be able to find a spot in the meta even if they aren't the best unit, though over time power and effectiveness does cause a discrepancy in that unit's use. Lastly, we have the internet personality effect. This is essentially like YouTubers or Twitch streamers or someone like that creating content based on a character, and then that character becoming popular. An example of this can be Ghast Summoner's Duel Tournament, and Elder V brought out Echo's Paula. Then we began to see her prominence rise in use, and this wasn't due to the fact that Echo's Paula got any stronger or she changed in any way, but it was due to the exposure she got and people being able to see how powerful she can truly be if given a chance. This can be very common. You see videos of showcases of certain units, and then all of a sudden everybody wants to try out that unit as well to see how strong they actually are, which then causes their use to go up, and inevitably they will show up more often in the meta. The opposite of this is also true. There are many powerful units that are not used very much because of their lack of popularity. This doesn't mean that these units are any worse than their more popular counterparts. It just means they don't get used as much and strategies aren't built around that unit as much. And in the same way, counter strategies aren't built as often around them. Now that we've talked about the two different types of meta in Fire Emblem Heroes, the strategies and the units, and all the variables of how they become meta, next week we can discuss the history of the meta, how the meta shifts, and how we've ended up where we are currently. The last thing I wanted to mention though is don't worry about the meta. Use the units you like. When it comes down to it, the success you have in Fire Emblem Heroes is not based off the meta or what meta units you're using. It's about how you execute strategies and the units you choose to use in those strategies. So even if you don't like any meta unit at all, you can still definitely succeed in Ether Raids just by having a good understanding of the game and how to counter those meta units. If you enjoyed the video, please drop a like and subscribe. Also drop a comment on anything you think I missed or any other aspects of the meta that you think is important for other people to know. Also drop a comment telling me who your favorite meta units are or which non-meta units you love to use. I'll catch everyone tomorrow with more Fire Emblem Heroes. See you then. Bye.